computer. There we go. All right, welcome. I think all of you know me by now, but just if you're watching a recording, I'm Rabbi Sydney. I've been here at Agudath since July of 2019. I live just a few blocks away with my husband and my son, Shalom Zimri. He's 4 months old, and my old dog, Buddy. I know that we're all coming here from different experiences with Judaism. So I want to start out with 5 minutes of writing answers to a couple of prompts. If you've got your textbook with you, these are in the textbook also, but I'll be showing it in PowerPoint form too. So the questions that we're going to be reflecting on today are these 4. My experience with Judaism so far is, at this time, what I find most attractive or compelling about Judaism. At this time, what I find most troubling or confusing about Judaism. And I am here because. And I'll give us 5 minutes, but if you are done before then, give me a thumbs up. Also know that the answers to these questions will be different every day. So it's okay if your answer today is different than it was yesterday or will be tomorrow. Just 1 more minute. sounds like a bird. All right. I'd love to ask, since you, Joyce, you were done writing pretty early on, I'm going to ask everybody to share one of their answers, just one of their answers, and you can pick which one. So Joyce, would you like to share one?
Okay. I'm going to go to the second one.
Great.
At this time, what I find most attractive or compelling about Judaism is the closeness, how it relates to the Old Testament. That from where I come from, we study the entire Bible, which has Old and New Testament. And I think it's so close to the Old Testament. I find that very attractive.
Wonderful. And remind me, so Sephirah,
Sephirah, right?
Is that right? Okay.
Right.
How, which one would you like to answer, and tell us a little bit?
Well, I'm kind of in between on the I am here because, and I guess the most troubling or confusing about Judaism, which I'm not finding it troubling or confusing. I guess the piece about how Jesus fits in as the whole Messiah from like my background. And I'm not fully resonating with that. It's the sense of, in my Catholicism and Christianity journey, it's been like Jesus is the only way to God. And so as a Native American, I have felt like I know Jesus, like I have experienced a lot of people deceased and shamanistic practices I've had. But it's troubled me about that concept of Jesus being the only way to God, because I didn't understand that. And what bothered me about it was, what about people that don't know anything about Jesus or can't even read? How can they then connect to God? And so to me, there's a simplicity to Judaism that resonates with me about knowing I can connect with God, just me and God. That always resonated with me. And as a child growing up, there were so many things in Catholicism that were so confusing and scary. And then in Christianity, the same thing. I just didn't understand. And I felt like as a child, it's hard to get the concept of Christ. As an adult, I've come to understand Christ to be more of a consciousness, a level of consciousness, whereas Christ wasn't a person. It was a guy named Jesus who was teaching about the consciousness of Christ, which is just about love and connectivity with other people and kindness. And so there's just a purity about the religion, about just me and God and praising God, and then bringing that love to other people. And that's what I really have liked, is that purity. And I feel a lot of peace. I feel a lot of peace when I go around the temple and I'm around the people too.
Great. And just for those, I know that the people here have had experience in the synagogue before, but if anybody's watching the recording, just to expand a little bit on what you're saying, in Judaism, it's one of the first things that I like to remind people about Judaism is that Jesus doesn't show up in any of our texts, isn't a part of our religious tradition. In Judaism, we have that direct connection to God. We have that understanding that everyone was made in the image of God, so there's no human being any holier than any other human being. We also have that distinction of that the Messiah has not yet come, and so for us, those are our big distinctions, right? That God is alone in divinity, and that our Messiah has not yet come. And that's, for a lot of people, one of the more challenging parts of Judaism is letting go of that. Kratina, which question would you like to answer?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I guess the question I want to answer is why am I here? That would best fit me more. And I'm here simply because I really want to learn more about Judaism, and how I feel about it is that the way I see it is something simply not just learning about simply a religion specifically. Sorry about the noise. But I see that it's something that takes a lot of discipline and education. And I realized that I had to, make time to be educated, to know about Judaism, to be able to practice that lifestyle daily, not just to learn about it, but I have to do that in steps. So that's why I'm here. I'm here more as more of a being observative, and from maybe kind of somewhat of a spectative position. So so forgive me if I'm somewhat more quiet than anything, but I'm just here to learn and expand.
Wonderful. And just to let you know, I know that we're a small group today. We may have another couple of people who are going to be learning with us in the future. But if there's ever a day that you don't feel like talking, or a question that you don't want to answer, you can always just say pass, or I'm not feeling like answering this right now. That's all right too.
Okay.
I'd like to share our syllabus. I know that you all got it, but I want to go through it a little bit. Because there are some things in here that are really useful to know. Everyone here has already registered for the class, but if you're watching and haven't let me know that you're committed to this class, you'd like to join, it is you do need to pay a fee for the class if you're not a member or staff member of the synagogue, and you can always contact me if you're having trouble with that payment. We are going to be meeting together 19 times at least, unless you want to learn more, and we can learn more as well. And if you haven't had enough of our Jewish learning together, or even if you have and you want to push yourself a little bit more, please, please, please come to synagogue anytime. We've got our services at 7:30 p.m. on Fridays and 10 a.m. on Saturdays. You can join in person, you can join online. If you have questions about, well, what do I wear to services and how do I show up and what do I expect? We'll cover all of that later, but you can always ask me. And anytime during the week that you have more questions, please feel free to ask me as well. We also have on the syllabus lots of mentions of holidays that are coming up and events that are coming up. I'll let you know the week beforehand, anytime something is coming up. So please feel free to join. You don't have to be Jewish or thinking about Judaism to come to any of our events. One thing to know about this syllabus is that there are links on here. So some of you have this textbook in print, but some of you are just looking at it online. So if you're looking at it online, you just click on that link and then you can get the textbook, but just in online format. All right. Just an overview of what we're learning together. Our first class, today, we're going to be learning about the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. And then our second class, we're going to be expanding to the Tanakh, which is Torah, those 5 books of Moses, Nevi'im, which is prophets, and Ketuvim, which is the writings. And all of that put together are the books that you may know as the Old Testament. In Judaism, we don't refer to it as the Old Testament, and we'll learn why. But they are all the same books that you would find in a Protestant Old Testament. I know that the Catholic Old Testament has a few extra, but the Protestant Old Testament, for the most part, has all of the same books. They're in a little bit of a different order. The translation will probably be a little bit different because the Jewish translations tend to translate directly from the Hebrew. Protestant translations often will translate from Greek, and both translations will use different assumptions because while in Judaism, the Tanakh is what it is, right? That's the holiness is in there. In some aspects of Christianity, the Old Testament is pointing towards something else. So in Judaism, we're not pointing towards anything. The text is what it is right then and there. We'll talk more about that next week, but we'll learn about Tanakh. Then we'll have a 2-week break for Passover, and you are welcome to come to any of our Passover services. We've got a lot of them. You are also welcome to help kosher our kitchen, which means make our kitchen dishes kosher. It requires a lot of boiling water and fire. So if you like fire, in a safe way, if you like fire, the afternoon of April 2nd, please come help us kosher our kitchen. Our third class will be about Jewish diversity. Being Jewish doesn't just mean one thing. So we're going to learn about the expansiveness of Judaism, and we're going to learn from three other rabbis. We're going to learn from Rabbi Jana, who's a Reform rabbi. We're going to learn from a Reconstructionist rabbi, I believe Rabbi Emily Cohen. And then we're going to learn from an Orthodox rabbi as well. Stay tuned for all of that. We are going to learn about the Jewish holidays in wide form, and then we're going to narrow in. We'll learn about Shabbat, which is the holiday that we have every week. That's our Sabbath, Friday night to Saturday night. Then we're going to learn about Jewish prayer. Then we'll learn about Passover a few months after Passover's over. I was thinking about doing the Passover unit next week, but I realized that there's a lot of stuff that we need to know before really tackling Passover. So we'll really look into Passover, and we'll ask some questions after Passover. So if you are going to the Passover Seder, or whether here or at somebody's house, and you have lots of questions about what's going on, write those down because we'll revisit them on May 18th. We'll talk about God on our 8th class. We'll talk about keeping kosher. What does it mean to keep kosher, and why in the world do we keep kosher? We'll learn that on June 1st. Then we'll learn about the Talmud on June 8th, because Judaism is not just about the Tanakh. It's not just about the Hebrew Bible, but there are texts after that that are holy too. So we'll learn about some of those texts that were written after that aren't seen as divine or as divine, but are still seen as holy. We'll learn about the high holy days, our holiest holidays. We'll learn a little bit about the Middle Ages in Judaism on June 22nd, but really on that day, our big focus is going to be just reviewing what we've done so far, because we'll have done a lot of different topics. We'll do a mid-session review, and then if we have time, we'll learn a little bit about the Middle Ages as well. In there, we're going to have a little intro to Kabbalah, but if we have more questions about Kabbalah, we can expand on that later too. We will learn about love in Judaism, the physical and emotional aspects of love, and a little bit about wedding practices too. We'll learn about Jewish parenting, but also about the rituals around raising kids, from the birth rituals to bar and bat mitzvah rituals, which are kind of our coming of age ceremony. We'll learn about mourning and sickness and all of the rituals regarding that, and all of how we, not only the rituals, but how we see ethically different topics that are really hard, different medical topics that are really hard, how we see that within Judaism. We'll learn about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, or the Shoah, on July 20th. Then we'll learn about Israel and one class on Israel certainly isn't enough, but we'll learn a little bit about Israel. And on that day, we'll actually be observing a fast day. So I may not be as upbeat as normal, but it'll be a fast day while we're learning, and we'll learn maybe a little bit about Tisha B'Av, about that fast day. Then we'll learn about what we might call tikkun olam, healing the world. We'll learn about how does Judaism fit into social action. That'll be our last topic that there's a textbook bit on. And then we'll have a wrap-up section on August 8th. That certainly won't be enough to finish all of our questions, but we'll get a start on finishing all of our questions then. Before I continue, any questions about what we'll be learning and how we'll be learning? Great. And these classes will probably be around an hour and a half long. Sometimes they'll be a little shorter, sometimes they'll be a little bit longer. I also want to cover, before we go on, I want to cover conversion, because I know that that a couple of people have asked whether you're interested in conversion or you're just curious how the process goes. In Judaism, we're not a religion that proselytizes. We don't demand that everybody become Jewish, and we don't think that Judaism is the right path for everybody on the planet. But if you're interested in becoming Jewish, please let me know, and we can talk about the conversion process together. It is at least a year-long process, because before we jump in, before somebody jumps into Judaism, we want to make sure that they're sure this is the process they want to go through. So we want to make sure that they celebrated all of the holidays of the calendar year, that you've done a whole lot of learning. And then at the end of the process, there is for women, there's a Beit Din, which is an interview with 3 rabbis. And then there's mikvah, which is immersion in a body of water. For men, there's also a physical aspect. We don't have any men in the class at this particular moment in time, so we won't talk about that unless you have questions later. But if you're interested in conversion, please let me know so that we can talk about that more intimately as well. Other things I want us to know before we dive into our actual subject matter are, outside of class, how in the world do I learn more about Judaism? Because as much as an hour and a half a week for 19 weeks is a long time, it's not enough to learn everything. I mean, I haven't learned enough to learn everything, but some of us really want to learn more. So I'll give you some recommendations about helpful books along the way, and then helpful websites along the way. Because, not just because it's always good to have recommendations, but also because when you search Judaism online or you search Judaism on Amazon, there are lots of different perspectives, and some perspectives that call themselves Jewish are not what we in the mainstream Jewish community would call Jewish. So I'm giving you some sources that I've found to be really helpful. If you come across books or websites and you're not sure, is this really Jewish? You can send them to me and ask. It's similarly when you're buying Judaica, when you're buying Jewish jewelry or candlesticks or a Chanukiah menorah. Sometimes they'll have insignia on it that isn't Jewish. And so if you're ever buying something or looking at a website or doing research and you have questions, you can always ask me. So some books. Each book about Judaism has its own flavor, so I've given you just a few. Anita Diamant writes, Choosing a Jewish Life and Living a Jewish Life. Choosing a Jewish life is about the conversion process. Living a Jewish life is an introduction to Judaism. Anita Diamant is very creative and she's very feminist. And so if feminism is appealing to you, great books to start out with, and they're very accessible. Wayne Dossick's Living Judaism is a little bit more academic, and Joseph Telushkin's Jewish Literacy is very academic. They're big, thick books, and they're great if you're into getting into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
Sarah Hurwitz, Here All Along, is her personal experience. She's been Jewish her whole life, but she rediscovered Judaism and wanted to start learning it from the beginning. So she shares her experience. It's a memoir, but you learn a lot from Judaism in that memoir. And Harold Kushner's To Life, A Celebration of Jewish Being and Thinking, is just delightful. It's an accessible read. It's a delightful introduction to Judaism. And anything else written by Harold Kushner is absolutely wonderful as well. He writes Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, which you might have heard of, which is a beautiful book. He writes a book about aging. He writes a whole bunch of books. And so he's a great author just to explore in general. For if you want to dig deeper past the introduction to Judaism materials, this is a great group of books too. Pinchas Giller writes Kabbalah, A Guide for the Perplexed. That makes Kabbalah actually something that's digestible. I would not read it before you know all the basics about Judaism in general, but it makes Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, a little bit more accessible. I will tell you right off, I don't know much about Kabbalah, but everything that I do know comes from that book and from a class with Rav Giller in general. If you want to learn about conservative halakha, The Observant Life is a wonderful source. Abraham Joshua Heschel's The Sabbath is just a beautiful book in general. It's really tiny. It'll take you an hour to read, but it's just a beautiful poetic look at the Sabbath in general. If you really want to learn about all the different Jewish texts that are sacred to us, like the Torah and the Talmud and Jewish law, Barry Holtz writes this or edits this book about our texts in general. Arthur Wasco writes Seasons of Our Joy. It's a kind of hippy-dippy look at the Jewish calendar. And then Elliot Dorff writes a lot of books about Jewish ethics. So he writes about Jewish medical ethics. He writes about ethics in the family. How do we treat each other as family members? He outlines how might we approach those things from a Jewish perspective. The Hebrew Bible, our Tanakh, you can get copies of that. You can get a whole bunch of different kinds of copies of that. In our gift shop, you can get a couple of these. The JPS Hebrew English Tanakh is one that a lot of us use. It's a pretty standard volume. The Jewish Study Bible is very academic. This is a very poetic version. Robert Alter's and Everett Fox's is very literalistic. So it doesn't sound pretty, but it goes directly with the Hebrew translation. I really want to highly, highly suggest the JPS Illustrated Children's Bible. And I think we've spoken about this one before. If you're not familiar with Bible stories or you want to have a refresh of Bible stories, the JPS Illustrated Children's Bible gives you an accessible language, some of the highlights of Tanakh. And nothing is whitewashed, right? It leaves everything in, but it tells the stories in condensed versions and language that's easy to understand. I've got a whole bunch of different recommendations for prayer books. It's a little difficult to use a prayer book if you haven't had experience with it before. So if you're thinking of starting a daily prayer practice within Jewish ritual, let me know and I'll sit down with you with the prayer book. We'll go over how to use it together.
Okay.
I'll also introduce some online resources for Jewish learning. Because again, some things that say they're Jewish websites are not so Jewish. So sources to find things. If you are just asking a standard question or you want to learn about some particular topic, My Jewish Learning is really, really a wonderful website, mujewishlearning.com. If you can't find something on My Jewish Learning, you can always use jewishvirtuallibrary.com. Jewish Virtual Library isn't as, it's not as appealing visually, and it's not as readily updated. It's not updated as often as My Jewish Learning. So I would look in My Jewish Learning first. And if you want to dive deeper, then you can go into Jewish Virtual Library. If you want to look at the primary sources, this is kind of a step further, but if you want to look at the primary sources, let's say that you don't have a Bible at home and you want to read from the Hebrew Bible, you can go to sefaria.org. It will tell you what the weekly Torah portion is, what the Haftarah is. We'll get to those later if you don't know what either of those things mean. But if you're looking for Tanakh, for example, you'll press Tanakh and it'll tell you a little bit about each of these books. So let's say I want to get to the creation story at the very, very beginning of the Bible. I'll go to Genesis chapter 1, and it'll have it in Hebrew and English. If you want to see it just in English, you press this little button in the corner and you can get it in just English. You can explore different translations in here too, if you want to be really fancy. If you want to be really fancy, you can look at different translations of the text. That's a little bit next level, but sefaria.org is a wonderful resource. So it's sefaria.org. And you don't have to whisper. Anyone, you can interrupt me with questions whenever you'd like. If it becomes too much, I'll let you know. Another website that's wonderful, another resource is hebcal.com or hebcal.com. It may or may not load. We'll see. Our internet here is not the best. But hebcal.com or hebcal.com will tell you the Hebrew date that corresponds with the English date. It'll tell you if there's a Jewish holiday coming up. It'll tell you what the Torah portion is. It's just a wonderful resource for knowing where we are in the Jewish year. And then we've got some next level links too. So if you really want to get a podcast about some of the inner workings of halakha, of Jewish law, or if you want to learn a little bit about Jewish history, a little bit more about Jewish history, elma.pardes.org is wonderful. Hadar.org is wonderful. Those have great resources. If you want to learn about conservative Judaism, that's our movement. These websites are great. And kids websites, again, like I said about the Jewish Study Bible, sometimes these websites are great, not just for kids, but for us in general. Right? Judaism, there's a whole Judaism 101 site, and there are lots of short videos that'll tell you a little bit about Jewish perspectives about different things and Jewish holidays. So bimbom.com is great for that. pjlibrary.org has similar resources as well. Let's see if Hebcal, nope, still didn't load. That's okay. And jwa.org, if you want to learn a little bit about Jewish women's history, really, really great resources here. It'll tell you about the first female rabbi, in each of the movements. It'll tell you about Jewish scientists and Jewish professors, trailblazers in their time, which if you have better internet access than we do here, you can look at those websites on your own. You have all of this in your syllabus, so no need to write anything down, but I just wanted to show you some of the resources that we have here. Any questions about any of those resources? Questions, comments, etc., about any of our resources, about the class in general? Great. Let's learn a little bit about Torah. Let me get up the PowerPoint that I was going to use. I get very excited, so I X out of windows that I need. Here we go. All righty. What is the Torah? So if you've been near us, if you've been with us at all at Agudath Achim or any other Jewish community, you may have heard the word Torah bouncing around. So a few different definitions of Torah. First, it's the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. So that's going to be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. If that was too fast, if you have no idea what those things are, no problem. We'll explain them in just a minute, but it's the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. When it's read liturgically, it's chanted from a handwritten parchment scroll. We read from the Torah every weekend. And next time you're at Agudath Achim, ask me, I'll show you the book up close. Or if you come to services, you'll see that book up close. And we treat not just the text as sacred, but we treat the actual physical scroll as sacred too, because it has those divine words of God. Now on that, for some, it's basic to faith that it was entirely from God, dictated from God to Moses. Moses wrote it down. It's been handed down throughout the generations, and it's God's literal word. For other Jews, it's divinely inspired. So it was written through human hands, but it still is divine word. For others, it's an entirely human document that was composed by multiple authors. I find the first explanation that's on this page to be the most helpful. Right? So when we're reading Torah, or when I'm reading Torah, I assume that it is God's word handed down to Moses. And for me, that is a belief that I hold, but beyond just holding that belief, it makes the experience of reading Torah all the more sacred. Even if when we're reading Torah, if we assume that as the word of God, it gives us a different reading experience than otherwise. And so we can read from different perspectives also, but it gives us a different experience religiously if we come into the text with that assumption. And we could talk more about that reading later as well. But just to know that it's not heresy to say, it's not considered heresy to say that, that someone may have written this down in the 7th century of before the Common Era. Some people are afraid of saying that. Not something you should be afraid of saying. It's a widely held Jewish notion. But at the core, it is our founding and most essential text, regardless of who it was written by. All right, 5 books of Torah. I would love for you to share with me, and you can share at your own pace. Who are some of the characters in these 5 books of Torah that you might know? Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve. Cain, Abel, right? So a lot of those are characters in Genesis. So, and many of the stories in Genesis are going to be the stories that we've heard a whole lot before. So within the book of Genesis, it has a couple of different parts. So Genesis, or Bereshit as we hear it in Hebrew, starts out with the creation of the world. Then there's a little bit of destruction with the story of Noah. Then the Tower of Babel divides us a little bit more. Once we've been built up a little bit, we're divided a little bit more with the Tower of Babel. After all of that, we have the stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs. I'll show you the family tree in a slide, but we've got patriarchs and matriarchs who are not just the descendants of us as human beings, but the descendants of us as Jews. The next chunk, we've got the story of slavery, the Exodus story, slavery to redemption. We're about to celebrate Passover, which is our celebration of that story. We then get the covenant at Sinai, which is all of the commandments that God is going to give us. This is where we get the 10 commandments, but not just the 10 commandments, but commands about how to practice, about what to do, what not to do in our everyday lives. Something to know about Judaism is that we're not just about those 10 commandments. We traditionally think about it as 613 commandments, but know that 613 is not an exact number. It's basically a symbolic way of saying we have a lot of commandments. Part of that too are stories about sacrifices, or not stories about sacrifices, but commandments about sacrifices. Just to give you a teaser or something to know in advance, in Judaism, we don't do sacrifices anymore. Don't worry, we do prayer and ritual instead of sacrifice. No sacrificing animals here, thank God. There are lots of stories of us in the wilderness. We have escaped from Egypt with the help of God. We've been given a bunch of commandments, and then we walk around the desert for a very, very long time. We complain to God, and then we get punished, and then things get better. And we complain to God, and then we get punished, and then things get better. That's the general wilderness story. There's a whole lot in there as well. But that's the general theme of the wilderness story. Because of all of our complaining, we end up wandering in the wilderness for 40 whole years. Although, if you look at a map, and we'll see a map in a moment, there's really not that much space between Egypt and the land of Israel. We just wander because we like complaining. And then Deuteronomy is our second telling of everything that's happened so far. So Deuteronomy, or really everything that's happened from Exodus through Numbers. What we don't have in this list on the right side is Vayikra or Leviticus. If you come to services this weekend, you'll read the first part of Vayikra. Leviticus is all about Levitical practices. It's all about the priestly stuff that we do. It's about the sacrifices that we make and the holidays that we celebrate. Why in the world do we still read that full book? Come to services this weekend to find out. But it still reminds us of the holidays that we keep, and it reminds us of the traditions of our ancestors as well. Reminds us too about the sacrifices that we make in daily life, for not the literal sacrifices, but the sacrifices, the time and money and effort that we give up to practice our Judaism. So I'll go over some of these bits from Torah in a little bit more detail, and then we'll go back to see if you have questions about those. In the book of Genesis, in the creation of the world, there are two different creation stories. Just something that many of us don't know, but there are two different versions of the creation story. Always fun to read and to compare. But here's our family tree, which I find really helpful. We've gone through Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel are their children. We've gone from Cain and Abel to through a whole bunch of different genealogies. So we hear a long list of genealogy from Cain and Abel all the way to Noah. And then we hear a bunch of genealogy after Noah. And eventually we get to Abraham. Abraham marries Sarah. And for a while, Sarah cannot have children. So Sarah gives Abraham Hagar, her servant. And Abraham and Hagar have Ishmael. Later, Sarah and Abraham have Isaac. Sarah, miraculously, at a very old age, is going to give birth to Isaac. one of our big stories is what we call the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. So Abraham hears from God to sacrifice his son, and thank goodness, miraculously, he does not have to sacrifice his son. I have lots of interpretations of that story. We have that question, what is most challenging to you about Judaism? Along with kashrut, along with keeping kosher, the strictures behind that. That story of Abraham and Isaac is one of my most challenging things about Judaism, reading that story. Ishmael and Hagar are banished to a different part of the world, become different people. So Isaac and Rebekah have Jacob and Esau. Esau kind of goes elsewhere as well. He becomes his own people. And Jacob has a whole bunch of children. These are all of Jacob's wives and children. If you want a little bit more detail about the Jacob story, the Jacob and Joseph story, Joseph here, you can watch Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, one of my favorites. But a whole big chunk of the end of Genesis is going to focus on Joseph's story. And the big significance of Joseph's story is that he brings the Jewish people to Egypt, which is where we start our next book. Big theme of our Abraham story in particular, but of this story of the matriarchs and the patriarchs, is what we call in Judaism Brit, which is a covenant or contract. Brit is also what we call the initiation ceremony for a baby. But here we're going to talk about it as a covenant or a contract. And this Brit is an agreement between God and the Jewish people as a whole, but really in Genesis, between God and Abraham, that the Jewish people, or Abraham's not ancestors, Abraham's descendants, will be blessed in a particular way by God. If we have time later today, we'll go over that. If not, we'll go over this next week. But there's in our textbook a great collection of texts that will teach us more about that idea of covenant, that idea of agreement, mutual agreement between God and the Jewish people. Just to see geographically where this journey is taking us, Abraham and Sarai and their descendants are going on this journey here. And Mount Sinai is going to be here. And then we've got the Jordan, where Israel's on this side. Or wait, is the Jordan? I need to look at this map again, because I have to say I'm terrible at geography, but I need to look at this map again. So I'm very excited to teach about this map, and then I'm completely disoriented. So I'll look at this map again, but we go from Mesopotamia to the land of Egypt, and then back to the general area. Questions about the land, questions about Genesis beyond this map that I should know and I don't? Great. You're allowed to ask questions, by the way, either in chat or by voice. We continue with the Exodus story. In the Exodus story, we have started out in the land of Egypt. The Exodus story itself, the first few chapters of Exodus are pretty extraordinary. We have a series of women who get the people Israel, or who bring Moses to safety. So the people Israel, it's been quite a while since Joseph brought the people Israel to Egypt. And when Joseph brought the people Israel to Egypt, or to Goshen, which is a particular area, when Joseph brought them there, They were respected. Joseph was respected. Joseph was the second in command of all of Egypt, but it's been enough generations that that Pharaoh had died out, perhaps more pharaohs after him. And now the people of Israel are expanding. God had said generations earlier, you're going to be as expansive, as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the grains of sand, in the sea. And behold, the people of Israel are numerous, and Pharaoh is terrified. So Pharaoh makes them into slaves. Not only is he terrified, but he needs some labor. And so he needs some free labor. So he makes the Israelites into slaves. And the slavery is still not dealing with their numbers, with their large numbers. Pharaoh's still scared, and so Pharaoh dictates, all right, we're gonna kill all of the male babies. And the midwives defy him. We're not sure whether the midwives are Hebrew midwives or just Egyptian midwives, but the midwives who are responsible for delivering those babies say, oh, they give birth too quickly. Sorry, can't kill them. And so Pharaoh says, fine, we'll throw all the firstborn, or we'll throw all of the males into the Nile. Now, we don't hear much about that period of time where those boys are thrown into the Nile, except that Moses is born. We don't know who he is yet, but Moses is born, and his mother saves him by putting him into a basket of reeds and sending him down the Nile that way. Moses' sister Miriam follows after him just to make sure the baby's safe. The daughter of Pharaoh finds Moses and adopts him as her own. Miriam, his sister, goes to the daughter of Pharaoh and says, let's have a Hebrew midwife or a Hebrew nursemaid for him. And so Moses is actually still raised within the Hebrew world as well. So we have Moses who grows up and becomes the leader of the people Israel. There are a lot of things that happen in between there, but he becomes the leader of the people Israel. He ends up murdering a man and fleeing, lives outside of Egypt for a while, and then God comes to him in a burning bush and says, all right, you're responsible for this people. Moses says, no, I can't be responsible. I hate public speaking. And God says, go anyway. Your brother will help you out, your brother Aaron. And God sends Moses back to Israel. God sends 10 plagues on the Egyptians while Moses is trying to get Pharaoh to let his people go. Eventually, Pharaoh lets his people go. They flee Egypt. And yet Pharaoh still chases after them. And as they're running away, the Sea of Reeds splits. The Israelites go to safety, and the Egyptians are drowned because the sea comes back in on itself. That's the Exodus story. After all of that escaping, we have the covenant at Sinai. Again, that idea of Brit. This time, the people Israel are making the covenant with God, not just Abraham and God, but the people Israel as a whole. We see God at Sinai. God gives us a bunch of commandments, including the 10 commandments. The people Israel revolt with this story of the golden calf. They create an idol, even though one of the big commandments is don't make idols. They create an idol that's a golden calf. And through Moses' guidance, God does not destroy all of them and start over again, but God gives them the commandments once again. Then we get a ton of ritual and ethical laws in the book of Leviticus. All right. These commandments are called in Judaism a mitzvah. A mitzvah is quite literally a commandment, but when somebody colloquially says, oh, it's a mitzvah, that means it's a good deed. So if you help someone cross the street, we'll say, you'll often hear somebody say, ah, what a mitzvah. It is a commandment to love others as yourself, right? It is a mitzvah to respect your elders. It is a literal commandment, but it's also just a nice thing to do. So just a nice thing to do is a mitzvah as well, and a term of the covenant, which is a commandment. There are traditionally 613 mitzvot, but again, that's just a way of saying there are a lot. There are two categories of mitzvot. One are the categories bein adam lemakom, which is between a person and God. Those are theological and ritual mitzvot. And then there's bein adam lechavero, the ethical or interpersonal mitzvot. So from what you know about Judaism, or from what you know about the Bible, what might be a mitzvah bein adam lemakom, a mitzvah between a person and God? Something that God might command us to do.
Love one another.
Love one another, except I would argue that that's bein adam lechavero. That's something that we do with another person.
Oh, that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so just between us and God.
Mm-hmm. So think about what's a theological or ritual mitzvah. So I can give one example. One example would be celebrating Shabbat. While I can certainly argue, and I often do argue, that celebrating Shabbat does make me a better person in dealing with others, it's one of those theological and ritual mitzvot. It's something that I do for God primarily. What's something else that might be a theological or ritual commandment?
Just pray.
To pray. Yeah,
Pray.
exactly.
That's
To
a
pray.
good one.
Mm-hmm. Keeping kosher might be another one.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of these ritual commandments. Building a hut on the holiday of Sukkot. That might be one. But loving one another is certainly a bein adam lechavero, a person between a person and their fellow. Returning a lost object. Respecting our parents. Those are those kinds of things. And often the lines are blurred between the two as well, because certainly caring for one another is something that is a mitzvah for God's sake as well. And certainly doing things in a ritual, organized manner makes us often better family members and better friends, and just generally better citizens, better community members. Our next act is the wilderness, the whole book of Numbers. Again, we argue against God, and then feel the consequences, and then that's okay. And then we're forgiven again and again and again. Some of these examples include arguing that we want meat. Then we're given manna. That's still not enough. We get to the land of Israel. We have some spies go in. They're terrified. And everyone says, I want to go back to Egypt. We're punished. But then God says, all right, let's make a deal. We'll just go travel around for 40 years, for the next 40 years instead. We've got some battles. We've got some of our most important characters are going to die. And we end with the realization that Moses is not going to enter the promised land, because Moses not really complains against God, but Moses, his temper rises. He hits a rock twice, even though he was supposed to hit it once, or not hit it. He was supposed to just speak to it. It depends who you ask. And then that final speech, Deuteronomy, is a summation of everything that's gone on. And in the last couple of chapters, the death of Moses. Questions thus far? All right. I want to share with you one of the big statements from Deuteronomy. If you have been to services before, you have heard this prayer. you've heard this prayer starting with Hear, O Israel. Adonai is our God. Adonai is one. If you've been to services, you've heard Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. That's our big central prayer in Judaism. Now, after that prayer, which is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, we've got a whole paragraph about what we should do with this Torah, what we should do with this teaching. What I'd like to do now is to read that paragraph and then ask ourselves the question, what is God commanding us to do here? How do we fulfill what God is asking? So, Sephora, will you read that paragraph starting from you shall love?
Yeah, I just need to move the box over. So, the video box is on top of it, or it's on like a little corner of it. Let's see. There. Okay. You shall love Adonai your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates.
Nice. All right. So both Cortina and Sephora, because Joyce had to leave early. What are some ways that we can do what God's asking of us here?
I perceive like to trust God rather than myself, rather than yeah, that's what comes across to me.
Great. How do I show that I trust God? What are some ways?
Love God, pray.
Okay, pray.
Yeah.
So that's an active way to do this. So we're thinking about active things. So
Sure.
we can pray. Here's a biggie. Impress them upon your children. So how might we impress them upon our children? Oops.
Teach.
Yeah.
Teach your children.
Yeah, teach your children. I know, Cortina, I've heard from your kids that you study the Parsha, that you study the Torah portion often. So teaching your children what your values are is a huge one. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away. That's what you're saying, Sephora, praying. When you lie down and when you get up. Quite literally, we think about this as saying this paragraph, as repeating this paragraph of the Shema when you lie down and when you get up. But more figuratively, we can think of that as really thinking about God at every moment we possibly can, thinking about these mitzvot as we don't just practice Judaism when we're at Shabbat services or at holiday services, but we practice Judaism all the time when I'm at home and when I'm away.
Exactly.
So bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Literally, we think about this as what we call tefillin, which are these ritual objects that we bind upon our arms and upon our forehead. And then inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. That's the mezuzah. That's a symbol that we keep on our doorposts. But beyond that, what can we do? Let's say that we didn't know about these ritual objects. What can we actively do that can help with this commandment, that can help with binding them as a sign on your hand, symbol on your forehead, doorposts of your house, on your gates? What can we actively do from here?
Clean.
Clean. Oh, I like that. Cleanliness is godliness. Great. Clean the house, right? You're respecting this world that God gave you, right? Absolutely. What are some visual reminders of God or Judaism that we could have around the house?
Tanakhs,
Yeah.
Torahs.
Yeah, have books around, have Jewish books around, or have have Jewish books around for sure. But as binding them as a sign on your hand and symbol on your forehead, I think part of that too could be, let's say, wearing clothing and jewelry that have Jewish symbols on them, like a tree of life or pomegranate.
What about as far as like it's a meditation way?
Say that again.
As far as meditation, like if you're not physically, but should I say, what is the word for it? Is it metaphorically
Or spiritually, sure.
or spiritually? When I say meditating on the Tanakh or meditating on the Torah, thinking about it.
Yeah. So it's keeping, you can keep the Torah and keep God in your mind all the time. But beyond that, you can set up a time to meditate. Let's say that we're saying that if we're looking at this sentence, recite them when you stay at home and when you're away, when you lie down and when you get up. You can, when you go to bed and when you wake up in the morning, say, I'm going to meditate for 5 minutes, or I'm going to meditate for 10 minutes. Set that time aside. Whether it's with the prayer book or whether it's just talking to God, whether it's clearing your head, absolutely. Absolutely. So it's having that reminder. All of these commandments are about setting reminders for ourselves and for our kids, for the generation that comes after us, even if we don't have kids, for the generation that comes after us. Sending reminders for ourselves that this God, that this Judaism is everywhere. It's not just for right here in the synagogue, but it's for wherever we are at all times. So I'd love to show you. There's, how long? This is 9 minutes. Might not have 9 minutes. Before we do this, before I show you that, because I might just show you that next week. I want to highlight something really, really important in Judaism. I know that I've asked this over and over. What questions do you have? Any questions? And I'm not just asking that as a symbolic any questions, but in Judaism, we are a tradition that really, really emphasizes questioning. Like I said before, there are different ideas of what the Torah is, of who wrote the Torah, and there are different questions about everything from the afterlife to how many from the afterlife to how to light Shabbat candles. Every single thing in Judaism, or many things in Judaism, will have many different ideas of how to do them, because we're trying really hard to get to exactly what God wants from us. We don't know for sure what God wants from us, but by each of us asking each other, questioning, challenging each other, we're going to get closer. And maybe someday we'll actually get there. But that's our quest, is to know what God wants from us and to do that. Not just to talk about it, but to do it. Which is why questioning is so important. So, Kratina, will you read for us this quote that's by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel?
Sure. What are your big questions? It is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of...
I can't hear you currently.
I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Okay. What are your big questions? It is customary to blame secular science.
I can't hear Kratina right now.
Okay.
But I can read this quote by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Just to give you some background on him, he was huge in the civil rights movement and in the anti-war movement. So he's a big proponent of he's a big proponent of what he says in another quote, praying with his feet. He prays not just by meditation and by saying words, but by doing out in the world. So he says this: it is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, and insipid. When faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion only speaks in the name of authority rather than with the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. Religion is an answer to man's ultimate questions. The moment we become oblivious to ultimate questions, religion becomes irreverent and its crisis sets in. The primary task of religion is to rediscover the questions to which religion is an answer. What is Rabbi Heschel saying in this quote?
I consider humanizing a religion. Like, it's not so much about like creed and that kind of thing, but like compassion and love and what we're looking for, search for God and closeness to God. Rather than just like, that's what comes to mind for me, is like an honest humanistic approach, and considering like that there's real human people at the church.
Yeah, they're real human people. Right.
Well, I think about, also I have all things that I remember growing up, kind of like, you need Jesus, you need to put Jesus first, and it's kind of like, what about, like, no, like, just talk to me. Like, I guess that's where I am, that's what I perceive from that's meaningful to me, is that rather than it being about a creed or a religion, is that there's human beings that are hurting and need to connect and want to connect with God and know God and connect with others.
Right.
And that's a significant thing to me about any religion.
Right. Absolutely. So I'm curious now, we're going to start each class, or we may start each class. We will start each class with a question that you've answered, or that you've asked. Whether it's a question that you're going to ask in just a couple of minutes, or it's a question that you've sent in, that you've emailed to me. So and we can brainstorm here, what are your big questions about Judaism that you want to make sure that we answer? Christina, do you have any questions about Judaism that you want to make sure that we answer?
Not specifically as of yet.
Okay. How about Sephira?
I do. So was Moses considered to be a prophet? Is that, or what is he?
Yeah. Was Moses considered to be a prophet? That's actually one that I can answer pretty quickly. Moses was a prophet. So a prophet is somebody who talks to God. And so Moses was a prophet. He's not any holier than anybody else, but he has a close connection to God, communication-wise. As you think about questions, please email me if there are big questions that are beyond the scope of our class. Email me. And I think we do have a few more minutes here. Rather than showing that video, there's a video that's pretty cool. But rather than showing that video, I want to I want to share with you more about that idea of covenant. What does it mean that we're in covenant with God? So I'm going in the textbook right now. And there are several different covenants with God. And in the textbook, you'll be able to read all of this. But the first covenant that exists with God is that covenant with humanity, that all humans are made in the image of God. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created man in the divine image. In the image of God were they created, male and female were they created. So God creates God in God's image, but in response, God charges us. God tells us, okay, you've got to be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, all the living things that creep on the earth. This is our first two-way promise with God, our first two-way brit, covenant with God, that we fill the earth, that God gives us the fish of the sea, that God gives us this world to work with. Our second covenant with God is God's covenant with Noah. God at this point has destroyed all of humanity, and then God realizes, well, humanity's never going to be perfect. There's never going to be perfection within humanity. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set my rainbow in the sky to remind myself that never again is there going to be a flood. So God sets the second brit. And in this case, it's that language of brit, that covenant is actually used. The next is that covenant with Abraham that I mentioned before. God says, Lech lecha. At this point, he's Avram. He's not yet Abraham. Go forth from your native land, from your birthplace, from your father's house. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. At this point, Abraham goes out. That's his action, and God's action in return is blessing him and all of his descendants. At Sinai, we have the covenant of where God has brought them out of Egypt. Now, God's asking, hey, people Israel, please do what I say in return. And the people Israel actually do say, they agree. They say, all the people Israel answered as one, saying, all that Adonai has spoken, we will do. The people Israel do say, we're going to do this, God. We agreed to that covenant. And the last covenant is the one that we just read, that we do, that we love God with everything that's ours in return for God letting us go to this land that they're about to go to this land of Israel. One thing I want to highlight that's not in this text here is that at some point later in Deuteronomy, we're going to hear that this Torah is not just for our ancestors. It's not just for the people who lived far behind, way before us. It's not, God will say the Torah is not in heaven, lo bashamayim hi. The Torah is not across the sea, but the Torah is here with us. It's doable for us to accomplish. This Torah is for the people who are living now, right here. It's supposed to be doable. It's supposed to be digestible, which is why we're learning here. We're learning in a step-by-step manner so that we can digest it, so that it's not something that's all the way up here, but it's something that we can use for ourselves. Whether or not we are deciding to be Jewish, we're living a Jewish life, hopefully, I hope that from this class, we can each get something to enhance our own lives, however our path is going forward. Any last questions or comments before we end for today?
Yeah, I just want to say something like I enjoy reading through that about the covenants.
Mm-hmm.
So when I read through this, you know, like the way I interpret it, it doesn't come across as like a history story, which I guess it is,
Mm-hmm.
but the way I interpret it or feel it is in a very metaphorical sense of how it relates to my life. Different changes, different decisions I've made that were good or not. And so like when I read this, it's almost like I pick up on my life and just how these different covenants and things are reflected in things I did right and things I haven't done right and things I continue to want to bring about in my life, I guess. So it's almost like the way that I see this is like my journey in my life is like I'm trying to get to Israel. And so like I've been in bondage and slavery and I'm escaping that and like looking to get to the promised land. So that's I just wanted to say that is kind of how this comes across to me.
And you'll enjoy the holiday of Passover because that's really what it's all about. Right.
Okay.
And I love that you're saying it doesn't really seem like history because even, back in the day, they thought about history differently than we do now. Today, when we think about history, we think of it scientifically, right? That this happened at this particular moment in time and it's literal, right? In Jewish tradition, we don't tend to think about it like that because the ancients didn't think about history like that. They thought about history more in that mythological perspective. It's still truth. This is all still truth. Everything that happened in Genesis is true, but it's true in a different way than we think about truth today, right? The Torah the world was not created in 7 literal 24-hour days, right? It was created in stages. The Genesis story is not supposed to teach us literal history, but what it's supposed to teach us is the flow of the world, right? Is God's creative power, is the glory of all of these different elements coming together and becoming this world that we see today. Right. And so I think it's wonderful that you're picking up on that. I think another thing to pick up on in that same sense is that a lot of the lessons we learn, especially in these stories about human beings, is that human beings are imperfect. We have all of these Genesis stories. We have human beings who do some great things. Abraham was wonderful. Abraham brought the monotheism to the world's eye and established these generations and generations of descendants who would become who we are now as Jews, and who many Christians and Muslims point to as their ancestor as well. But also, Abraham tried to sacrifice his son, right? That Abraham was not perfect. Abraham tried to pass his wife off as his sister, putting his wife in danger before his own life, right? So Abraham was imperfect. Jacob was certainly imperfect. All of these, even Moses was imperfect. And so that's a really big lesson that we can get out of the Torah in general, right? That we are imperfect, and yet there are ways to get forgiveness. There are ways to move on from our imperfections. I think that's a big message that we can take.
Awesome.
All right. I'm going to log off, but I'm excited to see you next week. I'm excited to learn more Tanakh. And next week, we'll start out also by, there's a video that I would love to show you about how Torahs are made, how the physical Torah scroll is made. We'll start out. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
All right, you too.
Bye.